You, the new girl. Amara, is it? We're all demonstrating today. Come up, let's hear what you can possibly do with this.
Unless you have nothing to offer this advanced class but a warm body.
Her name was Amara Johnson, and for 17 seconds, standing in the aisle of the Crestview Academy Music Suite, she was nothing but a hypothesis to be proven wrong. 4 hours earlier, the city had sounded different. The 7 a.m. bus from Southview rattled with a familiar, comforting chaos. Her grandmother's hand on her shoulder at the stop had been an anchor. "Play your story, baby," she'd said, "not theirs." Crestview's granite pillars and manicured lawns were a different planet. The silence here was expensive, and it watched you. In Advanced Music Theory 202, Amara was the only black student. She was a line item on a diversity report, a provisional entry in a ledger. And to Miss Beatrice Vance, the department chair whose approval was the only key that mattered, she was a problem in need of a swift, elegant solution. A lesson, not for Amara, but for everyone watching, about where true artistry was supposed to come from and where it was not. The first 3 days were a study in invisible walls. Amara would enter, take her seat in the back corner, a seat that seemed to have been left empty for her purposefully. Miss Vance's eyes would slide over her during roll call, as if her name generated no image in the teacher's mind. When the class discussed the emotional resonance of a Chopin nocturne, Amara, whose hands had physically ached learning that very piece, listened as Miss Vance extolled its European sorrow, its civilized melancholy. A boy named Lucas gave a clumsy technical analysis and was praised for his incisive intellect. Amara once whispered a correction to a mislabeled chord progression to her neighbor. Miss Vance's head snapped up. "Is there a shared insight back there, Miss Johnson, or just a shared distraction?" The room stiffened. The message was clear. You are a guest here, a quiet guest. The grand piano on the central platform was not an instrument in this room. It was an altar, and Miss Vance was its high priestess. Students approached it with a mix of reverence and terror. Their performances were dissected with a calm, surgical precision that left some red-faced and others in tears. It was, she often said, how excellence was forged. The day of the first major practical assessment dawned gray and damp. The room smelled of lemon polish and nervous sweat. One by one, students were called to perform a portion of Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier. The air grew thick with concentration and fear. Amara watched, her face a calm mask. Inside, a storm of memory, not of this room, but of a sunlit living room in Southview, with a second-hand upright piano, its middle C key chipped at the edge. Her grandmother's voice, smoky and warm, counting time. "The music isn't in the paper, child. It's in the space between the notes you play and the notes you feel." The scent of incense and simmering greens, the feeling of a rhythm so deep it felt like a heartbeat from the earth itself. That was her foundation, not this cold, polished scrutiny. Lucas finished his piece with a flubbed final cadence. Miss Vance offered a thin, forgiving smile. "A noble effort, Lucas. The intention was pure." Her gaze then swept the room, a predator scanning for weak prey, and landed with finality on Amara. "Miss Johnson, you've observed long enough. We'll conclude with you." She gestured to the piano. "Let's assess your foundational level. Let's see." She flipped through a binder of sheet music, her finger tapping theatrically. "Ah, this is suitably basic. Lightly Row, an American folk song. Simple, clean, approachable for all skill levels." She placed the single, almost insultingly simple sheet on the stand. It was music for a first lesson, for a young child. A titter, quickly stifled, ran through the class. This was no longer an assessment. Amara watched, her face a calm mask. Inside, a storm of memory, not of this room, but of a sunlit living room in Southview, with a second-hand upright piano, its middle C key chipped at the edge. Her grandmother's voice, smoky and warm, counting time. The music isn't in the paper, child. It's in the space between the notes you play and the notes you feel. The scent of incense and simmering greens, the feeling of a rhythm so deep it felt like a heartbeat from the earth itself. That was her foundation, not this cold, polished scrutiny. Lucas finished his piece with a flubbed final cadence. Miss Vance offered a thin, forgiving smile. A noble effort, Lucas. The intention was pure. Her gaze then swept the room, a predator scanning for weak prey, and landed with finality on Amara. Miss Johnson, you've observed long enough. We'll conclude with you. She gestured to the piano. Let's assess your foundational level. Let's see. She flipped through a binder of sheet music, her finger tapping theatrically. Ah, this is suitably basic. Lightly Row, an American folk song. Simple, clean, approachable for all skill levels. She placed the single, almost insultingly simple sheet on the stand. It was music for a first lesson, for a young child. A titter, quickly stifled, ran through the class. This was no longer an assessment. This was a ritual of humiliation. Amara felt the heat of 30 pairs of eyes. She saw the smug pity on Lucas's face. She saw the bored anticipation of others, waiting for the cringe, the stumble, the satisfying confirmation of their unspoken beliefs. But most of all, she saw Miss Vance's expression, a placid, expectant triumph. This was the moment she would gently, publicly expose the administrative error of Amara's presence and restore the natural order of her classroom. Amara stood. The room seemed to tilt. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. Play your story. She walked to the front. Each step was a decision. She did not look at the sheet music. She looked at the piano, this beautiful, cold, perfect instrument. She opened the fallboard. She sat on the bench, its leather cool through her skirt. She adjusted it, a small, professional motion. Miss Vance stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a living monument to judgment. Amara's hands hovered over the keys. She took a breath that seemed to draw all the oxygen from the room. And then she began, but not with Lightly Row. Her left hand descended, not on a simple triad, but on a deep, rolling, complex bass pattern that was the bedrock of a gospel progression. It was the sound of Sunday morning, of call and response, of a history carried in song. It was rich, it was warm, it was fundamentally alive. Then her right hand entered, not with a melody, but with a cascade of glittering chromatic runs that twisted and curled like smoke, a technique called fioritura, ornate and incredibly difficult. It was a fusion, a declaration. It said, "My foundation is deeper and more complex than you can imagine." Miss Vance's crossed arms tightened, her brow furrowed in confusion, then in dawning alarm.
Amara transitioned. The gospel-infused improvisation melted into the opening bars of Sergei Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She was playing the orchestra's part and the soloist's part, condensed into one, a feat of arrangement and sheer physical power. The chords were monumental, the melodies soaring and desperately lonely. The music swelled, filling the high-ceilinged room, crashing against the windows. A girl in the front row had tears welling in her eyes, provoked by the sheer, unexpected beauty of it. Lucas's mouth hung open. Amara's body was no longer that of a hesitant student. It was a conduit. She leaned into the phrases, her dynamics moving from a whisper to a roar. This was not playing, this was possession. She played the concerto's most famously aching theme, and in it you could hear every lonely bus ride, every dismissive glance, every quiet doubt transformed into something majestic and sorrowful and strong. Miss Vance had taken an unconscious step backward. Her carefully constructed facade, the arbiter of taste, the gatekeeper of quality, was crumbling in real time. Her eyes were wide, not with admiration, but with a kind of horrified recognition. She was witnessing not just talent, but a pedigree of skill that far surpassed her own. This was competition-level, world-class artistry. In her classroom, from this girl. And then Amara did the unforgivable. She made it look easy. As the last thunderous notes of the Rachmaninoff climax faded, she seamlessly pivoted. The Russian winter vanished, replaced by the sun-drenched, rhythmically devilish harmonies of the Charleston by James P. Johnson, a masterpiece of Harlem stride piano. Her left hand became a powerhouse, leaping octaves with machine gun precision, setting a joyful, relentless pulse. Her right hand danced, laughed, and mocked with playful, syncopated brilliance. A real, radiant smile broke across Amara's face now. This was joy. This was heritage. This was play. The class was transported. They were no longer in a stifling assessment. They were in a speakeasy, a rent party, a celebration. Heads nodded, feet tapped under desks. For the first time, the room felt alive. The final chord of the Charleston was a bright, declarative slam. Then silence. A sacred, stunned silence. Amara's hands fell to her lap. Her chest rose and fell slightly. The spell was broken, but the world had changed. She turned slowly on the bench. She looked at her classmates, seeing their shock, their awe, their shame. Then she turned her gaze to Miss Vance. The teacher looked pale, shrunken. The weapon of her authority had been turned back on her, and it was blunt and useless.
Amara's voice, when it came, was clear, calm, and carried no trace of anger, only finality. My first piano was my grandmother's. It had a broken hammer in the bass clef, so I learned to compensate by voicing the inner harmonies more strongly. I've been a featured soloist with the National Youth Philharmonic for 3 seasons. I hold the youth record for the fastest sanctioned performance of Rimsky-Korsakov, Flight of the Bumblebee, without error. The sheet music you gave me, she said, nodding toward the childish, lightly row, is for beginners. I am not a beginner. I never was. She stood up from the piano bench. The simple act felt regal. Miss Vance opened her mouth. Nothing came out. A dry click. She tried again. I was not aware. Of course you weren't, Amara said softly, not with malice, but with a devastating truth. You didn't ask. She walked back to her seat in the silent room. The walk back felt infinitely longer than the walk up. This time, they weren't watching a hypothesis. They were watching a fact. The aftermath was not a single event, but a slow, inexorable unraveling. The story, of course, leaked immediately. It wasn't just about the music, it was about the sheet music, the insultingly simple, lightly row. By the end of the day, cell phone video, recorded illicitly, was being passed around, not of the whole performance, but of Miss Vance placing that sheet on the stand and the first 30 seconds of Amara's response. The contrast was damning. Amara's grandmother, a woman who had fought battles Amara could only imagine, made one phone call, not to yell, but to ask calm, pointed questions of the principal and the school board's equity officer. A meeting was convened. Amara's full portfolio was presented, competition certificates, letters of recommendation from world-renowned maestros, performance reviews. The question shifted from "did this happen?" to "how could a teacher with this bias be in charge of assessing this student?" An internal review was launched. Other students, emboldened, came forward. The black cellist who was always placed in the back of the section, despite having the best tone. The Latino drummer who was told his style was too aggressive for the jazz band. The pattern emerged, clear and systemic. Miss Vance's high standards had a specific, discriminatory filter. She was placed on administrative leave within a week. Her resignation followed before the month was out. The official statement cited a desire to pursue other opportunities. The unofficial understanding rippled through the school.
prejudice had met proficiency, and proficiency had won. Amara Johnson finished the year at Crestview. She was quietly offered a role as a student assistant for the music department, tutoring peers in theory. She declined, choosing instead to focus on her own composition. At the annual Crestview Gala, she performed not Rachmaninoff, not a jazz standard, but an original piece entitled South View Suite. It began with the sound of a bus engine, transformed into rhythm, wove in echoes of gospel, of stride, of classical grandeur, and ended with a simple, clean, hauntingly beautiful rendition of Lightly Row. It was her story, and this time, when the silence fell after the last note, it was a silence of respect, earned down to the bone. The piano on the stage was just a piano again. The altar had been dismantled, because the true altar was never the instrument or the room or the approval of a gatekeeper. It was the space between the notes you play and the notes you feel. It was the history in your hands and the future in your touch. Amara played that day, but what she really did was hand an entire room their own reflection and ask them to listen to what it sounded like when it broke. And in the ringing silence that followed, the only thing left standing was the truth. And the truth, my friends, has many movements.